All right, so let's try this one more time. I tried recording this video already, and it was very rambly and was not very to the point. So it's getting close to banlist season, everybody. And for those of you that aren't aware, in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, when banlist season rolls around, that means one of two things happens. One, people clamor for there to be a ban list, calling for very specific problems within the format to be taken out. Or two, people dread the ban list coming and worry that their favorite decks are going to get hit. Now, where do I fall into that camp? I'm currently playing nothing but garbage tier 2 or below decks, so I'm not super worried that I'm going to lose any copies of anything in an upcoming list. If anything, some of my decks could get some stuff back, and that'd be pretty lit. But I'm not really here to discuss the ban list in broad terms. I'm here to talk about one specific type of card that always comes up when discussing the ban list, and that is what I like to refer to as the 0 or 3 card. What's a 0 or 3 card? Well, a 0 or 3 card is a card that a majority of the community, or at least a big subset of the community, has decided is only healthy for the game if it is at 0 copies or 3 copies. 1 and 2, not good. It's just not good. Now, there are some cards whose existence and the way that they play really make them feel tailor-made for the semi-limited list. I would argue Destiny Hero Malicious is perfect to be on the semi-limited list, as having 2 copies of it means that you can send one to the grave and it can summon the second copy from deck. And I would argue that even though it's not at 2 in the TCG, Kashtira Fenrir is a great sort of candidate for that as well, as having 2 allows Kashtira to still play it and draw it at least every once in a while, but it also makes it a decent splash in other decks where it can be summoned and then search itself and basically be a 2-card self-contained engine that puts up a disruption but also replaces itself in the hand. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But for the most part, cards tend to exist in sort of one of 3 places. They're either banned, limited, or unlimited. And the semi-limited list is sort of this space that a lot of players think could really just go away, right? Because Destiny Hero Malicious could very easily either go to 0 or go to 3, and that would probably be fine either way. Hero players like myself would be sad if it went to 0, and it would probably see play in a lot of really annoying decks if it went to 3. But it very easily, if Konami thinks that putting it at 3 is a problem, they could just put it at 1 or 0, which putting it at 1 is functionally putting it at 0. But, I mean, what are you going to do? But there are other cards that sort of exist in the semi-limited list. They've also in the past used the semi-limited list as sort of a quarantine zone when a card is put to 1 and then it's been at 1 for a really long time. Konami thinks maybe we can put it to 3, but they don't want to just put it directly to 3. Or, if it's coming off of the banned list, sometimes they'll put it to 1, then 2, then 3, just to sort of feel it out. But in the grand scheme of things, most cards, the vast majority of cards in the game, exist at 0, 1, or 3. And cards that exist on the limited list, a lot of them are power 1-ofs, cards that have extremely powerful effects that their power is curbed by the fact that you can only play 1 of it in your deck. Cards like Monster Reborn, cards like Infernity Launcher, cards like, I think at the current moment, cards like Harpy's Feather Duster. These cards that either are archetypal power cards or exist as power cards generically. And typically, the limited list is sort of where Konami puts cards that they don't really want in the format, but they also don't want to just get rid of entirely because they do fill a niche. A card like Instant Fusion, while it is annoying and it does facilitate a lot of annoying plays and requires you to sort of design cards around the fact that any level 5 or lower fusion that can be fusion summoned, it can easily just be summoned out of the extra deck for free. And the fact that instant fusion counts as a fusion summon circumvents a lot of limitations that if it were just a summon from deck, it would be different. But the fact is that they want instant fusion in the format so that it can sort of fill certain niches and allow certain decks to be able to play certain cards. Like Thunder Dragon's ability to play Katamari attack, the level 5 Thunder fusion. Like that was cool for instant fusion to be able to do. But in order for Thunder Dragon to be able to play Katamari attack, you also have to allow decks to be able to play instant fusion for Thousand Eyes Restrict or Millennium Eyes Restrict, or allow them to summon things like Winda or Raijin and stuff like that. Things that can hypothetically be used as either pieces of interaction or as parts of an end board. There were Orcus pilots that would summon a Winda off of an instant fusion and then protect it from the instant fusion destruction using a material off of Dingirsu, and then your opponent had to contend with a Winda. Is instant fusion better at 0? Probably. They've already released a more balanced version of instant fusion and ready fusion, so I don't really think instant fusion needs to be around anymore. A lot of the cool things that instant fusion sort of enabled, things like allowing certain decks to be able to play extenders that took slots in the extra deck, being able to sort of summon these cool vanilla fusions from a long time ago that are good because of their stats or because of their attribute or type or whatever, or their level, and have those be integral pieces of a strategy. I mean, Ready Fusion does that. Instant Fusion could very easily go to 0. And there was a point in time when Kit Kalos was legal that people thought it would. And the fact is that Instant Fusion feels like a 0 or 3 card. It feels like a card that's really only worth having in the format if it's at 3. Because then you can have it at max consistency. Because having it as a 1-of feels really sacky. A lot of games during tier format felt extremely tilting when your opponent would open instant fusion, because that was the god card. Being able to summon Kit Kalos off of instant fusion was insane. And that is just sort of one example of a 0 or 3 card that I think Konami put at 1, but may as well be a 0 because nobody plays it. And the people that do play it are playing it on the off chance that they draw it. But its existence in the format limits what they can get away with. It's only a matter of time before they decide to print something that makes instant fusion far too strong and makes it where they have to ban it. A deck that can search instant fusion and then summon an insane monster from the extra deck and then protect it possibly. But there's other examples of cards in the format right now. The card that made me make this video was Called by the Grave. Brian from Crush Cards talked about it in their Let's Top Locals video. I can't remember which episode it was, where he was talking about how he got sacked by Called by like 2 or 3 games in a row. And the fact is that it feels bad to be sacked by a 1-of, especially a 1-of as strong as Called by. And much like Instant Fusion, Called by has an issue of it has a primary purpose that it was designed for, but it was made so generically that it actually does a lot more than it was designed to do. Instant Fusion, I think, at least, was designed as be able to use slots in the extra deck as free materials to be able to extend, to be able to get access to certain plays. Katamari attack allowed you to go into a Titan without having to sort of actually use 3 materials, because the Katamari attack fulfilled the condition of needing a fusion thunder on the field, and then you could banish a thunder from your hand in order to summon Titan. Normally, you would have done that with Colossus, but since Colossus is banned, you can't do that anymore. And the only other way to do it in Archetype is with double-headed Thunder Dragon, which is just not going to happen. You're summoning double-headed Thunder Dragon off of Thunder Dragon Fusion. You are down horrendous, okay, my dude? And the fact is that Instant Fusion allowed you to do that. But Ready Fusion also allows you to do it. So the existence of Instant Fusion means you now have 4 copies of a card that do it. But if you draw the 1 in 4, you also have the opportunity to flex other slots in your extra deck if you had them. Again, things like Thousand Eyes Restrict, things like Millennium Eyes Restrict. And you can more easily go into cards that are even stronger and offer even more utility. Millennium Eyes is basically hand trap insurance. So a lot of decks played Instant Fusion as a means to sort of play around hand traps. You summon the Millennium Eyes as your first action, and suddenly your opponent can't ash you, right? But Called by the Grave is a little different, because Called by the Grave, while it does have game against specifically hand traps, you can also draw it, and if your opponent doesn't hand trap you, you can also just set it as an interruption. Like, it's basically a DD Crow, but it's also like Solemn Strike in some instances. Like, you can use it to remove cards from the graveyard if they're being targeted or if their effects are trying to activate and they like need to summon themselves from the grave. But also, if your opponent ends up with a copy of a monster in a grave that they also have on field or in hand and they're trying to activate it, you can just banish the copy they have in grave, and then suddenly you've like blanked that card's effect for the rest of this turn and the next turn. That's really strong, like unbelievably strong. So, there's a really good argument to say that it should be at 0. And the fact that it's at 1 does mean that in a lot of instances, you just find yourself in a scenario where either you or your opponent just drew the 1 of, and that does not feel very good. It really doesn't. There's a lot of cards that feel like that. Another crazy example is Pot of Prosperity. Pot of Prosperity does feel like a 0 or 3 card. Now, 0 or 3 cards kind of exist in this space where they kind of fill one of two sort of roles. They either heavily raise the ceiling on what a deck is capable of, or they heavily boost a deck's consistency in being able to achieve its win condition. Now, a card like Instant Fusion, I would argue, is more of the former, being a card that raises the ceiling on how powerful a deck can be. Again, Orcus can basically go full Orcus combo, and if they end on Dingirsu on field, they can then add a Winda onto that end board and protect it with the Dingirsu. So, that's really, really strong, right? And ultimately, that became strong enough that a lot of people thought that, Instant Fusion was a problem. And Instant Fusion also existed as a means of kit colossing without having to actually mill anything. And you could basically, as your like second and third action, kit coloss and mill 5 without having done a single thing prior to that, without having activated Rhinoheart, without having activated a single miller. You could just get into your kit coloss, and that is way too strong. That heavily raises the ceiling on how strong their deck can be, because the tier limit activation that would have summoned the Kit Coloss can now summon something different. It can either summon a Root Coloss, it can summon a Kaleido Heart, or it can go into something like a Mud Dragon or a Dragostapelia. The Mud Dragon could be material for something like a Bahamut Shark or a Dweller. And suddenly your opponent has an extra material that would have been used for something else simply because they drew a 1 of or a 3 of, depending on if we're talking about it when it was at 3 or when it was at 1. Tier Limits wasn't playable when Instant Fusion was at 3 because it hadn't been released yet. But if the card went to 3, that would be the implication. It would be a card that drastically raised the ceiling on how powerful Tier Limits can be. Now, Prosperity is a card that boosts consistency. And this can be seen in real time as Master Duel put Prosperity to 1. There are a lot of decks that people say are being gatekept out of the format simply because they lost 2 copies of Prosperity, the most common being Kashtira. Now, there's more to the reasons Kashtira isn't playable than just 2 Prosperity was taken away from them. But you'd think a deck that has access to its strongest boss monster and has access to a lot of the power cards that it had in the TCG, you'd think it would be better, but it's not. And the fact is that it's just not at full power in the same way that it was in the TCG. It lost a lot of copies of a lot of its really strong cards. You know, its field spell is at 1. A lot of its main deck monsters are at 2. And again, a lot of the cards that helped boost its consistency are also limited on the limit list. Like Prosperity's at 1, and a lot of the other cards that allowed you to be able to turbo through your deck are also not in the format. So that being said, you have a scenario where there's a lot of cards that feel like they shouldn't even really be in the format at all. My argument that I want to make is that if a card is a 0 or 3 card, it's probably just should be a 0. And no card has seen this be more true than Max C, the poster child of 0 or 3 cards. The card that everyone and their grandma in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, every time the ban list comes around, says that if Max C is going to come back, it needs to come back to 3. Because if it's at 1, that's just too sacky. It becomes something you have to deck build for that you're only going to see 1 out of every like 15 games. But that 15th game, if you're not prepared for it, you're going to get blown out. And the fact is that at 3, it completely warps the format in a way that I don't think TCG players were fully prepared to wrap their heads around. I think the OCG has done a pretty okay job of keeping Max C at bay in terms of causing it to fully warp the format. But even then, there's a lot of decks in the OCG that are playable strictly because Max C is legal in that format. The fact is that there are a lot of decks that, like Sprite in its original form, was a deck that basically turboed into searching Max C. And Vanquish Soul was as strong as it was on release in the OCG because Max C was a free earth to be able to reveal off of one of the Vanquish Soul effects. So Max C is game determinatively strong, a card that can end turns and basically completely swing tempo in a person's favor. And the fact that Max C is sitting at a cool 93% usage on Master Duel should give you a pretty good idea that it is the strongest card in the game. Not one of, it is the strongest card in the game. A card that pretty much every deck has to play. And it is so strong in game warping that decks that don't have to deal with it, don't have to worry about it, are kept in the format artificially because so many slots in a person's deck are dedicated to playing the Max C minigame that if you don't have to worry about it, there's a ton of flex slots that you suddenly have opened up. You have to play the 3 copies of Max C. You have to play the 3 copies of Ash, which counters the Max C. You have to play a copy of Called By. I believe it's at 2 in Master Duel. And then you play the singular copy of Crossout. That is 9 slots in your deck that are the same across 90% of decks. And it's proven by the fact that when Tier Limit was the best deck in the TCG, Ash was a mid hand trap. It was a card that did not do enough. It was not good, and most people didn't play it at all. And if they did play it, it was a side deck card for matchups that weren't Tier Limit. But in Master Duel, when Tier Limit was the best deck, Ash was sitting at a 90+% usage rate, even though it's not that good against Tier Limit, because you need it to counter the Max C. What more do you need? Okay? Max C is the poster child of a card that people say should be either at 0 or 3. Every card I've talked about up to this point is a card that people don't really talk about Prosperity in this conversation, but they're all cards that people have said, you should either have it at 0 or at 3. At 1, it's too sacky. And the fact is, if a card feels like a 0 or 3 card, it's a 0 card. It should be banned. It's too strong. If it feels sacky when your opponent opens it, then that means it's game determinative, right? Called by is exactly like that. Every time somebody opens called by, their chance of winning skyrockets. Every time someone opens instant fusion, their chance of winning skyrockets. Unless they're playing instant fusion just as a means to summon a vanilla, in which case it might as well have been a ready fusion. And this is true of called by as well. Called by also has an alternative that Konami released that attempts to do what called by was meant to do without all of the extra stuff added on top of it. If you look at Crossout Designator, it is currently at 3 in the TCG and nobody plays it. It's a niche card that's used in certain decks in order to sort of out certain problem cards. Like I got cross-outed by a Kashtira player during full power Kashtira format, and that felt debilitating because my Nibiru was blanked. But the fact is that for the most part, this card isn't very good, and it didn't become strong enough to warrant seeing any sort of hits. But in Master Duel, where Max C is at 3, Crossout Designator is at 1 because it is one of the most efficient outs to Max C. And one of the things that makes Crossout so much stronger against Max C than Called By is the fact that it doesn't linger for 2 turns. Strangely enough, the fact that Called By lingers for 2 turns is actually a hindrance in the Max C minigame, because if you Called By your opponent's Max C on your turn, you can't Max C them on their turn. And that's a problem. And that's something that people consider. That's how game warping this card is. That's how much this card changes the math on how good certain cards are. It's, again, the poster child for 0 or 3 cards. But I'm going to say it again. If it is seen as a card that should either be at 0 or 3, it should be at 0. It should be banned. Instant Fusion should be banned. Called By should be banned. And Max C should be banned. There's an argument to be made that Pot of Prosperity should probably be banned too. But ultimately, for now, Pot of Prosperity is not as big of a problem as it might otherwise be. I can maybe see it going to 1 or 2. There was an argument to be made that Desires was a 0 or 3 card at one point, but banishing 10 is just too much of a risk in decks where you have 1 or 2 one-ofs that you need in deck in order to be able to play the game. And playing them at 2, it doesn't work. It's just not good enough. But, that's it for the discussion. This video is basically equally as long as the one I recorded before, but I feel like it's way more concise and to the point than the last one was. I feel like I got a lot more good points in there. So, if you have thoughts and feelings on this, let me know in the comments. Hashtag #BanMaxC in Master Duel. Shout out to Hardleg. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next one.